Hello there, and welcome to Sleep Through Ages. Tonight we're looking at the final days of the Ottoman court, often remembered as the sudden collapse of a medieval dynasty, but better understood as the terminal phase of a long-standing systemic deadlock between an ancient monarchy and a modernizing nation-state. The Dolmabahçe Palace in Istanbul, standing on the edge of the Bosphorus, was a structure built to reflect a specific kind of 19th-century grandeur. Unlike the older Topkapi Palace, which was a sprawling complex of secluded courtyards and ancient traditions, Dolmabahçe was a linear, baroque expression of a state trying to look toward Europe. It was here, in November 1922, that the final Sultan, Mehmed VI Vahid-ad-Din, navigated the closing hours of a dynasty that had lasted for over 6 centuries. On the surface, the palace remained a place of hushed reverence, but the deeper issue was that the authority it housed had already evaporated. The rituals of the court, the saluting guards, the bowing eunuchs, and the formal protocol continued out of habit, but the logistical and political reality of Turkey had shifted to Ankara, the new heart of the nationalist resistance. At a superficial level, the end of the Ottoman Sultanate appeared to be a direct result of the First World War. The empire had sided with the Central Powers, and its defeat had led to the occupation of Istanbul by British, French, and Italian forces. However, at the core of the conflict was a much older problem: the inability of the Sultanate to reconcile its role as a universal religious caliphate with the requirements of a sovereign ethnic nation. By the time Mehmed VI ascended to the throne in 1918, the Ottoman state was no longer a functioning administrative unit. It was a contested space where international treaties and domestic rebellions competed for control. The Sultan found himself trapped in a palace that had become a gilded cage, surrounded by foreign warships in the harbor and a growing revolutionary movement in the interior of Anatolia. The real tension lay in the dual nature of the Sultan's position. He was both the Sultan, the temporal ruler of an empire, and the Caliph, the spiritual leader of the global Muslim community. In the background, the nationalist movement led by Mustafa Kemal Atatürk had already established a rival government in Ankara. The nationalists did not initially seek to abolish the monarchy. They sought to liberate the Sultan from foreign occupation. But as events unfolded, it became clear that the Sultan and the nationalists had two entirely different visions for the future. The Sultan saw the British as a necessary evil to preserve the dynasty, while the nationalists saw the dynasty as an obstacle to the birth of a modern republic. This systemic misalignment meant that every decision made in the quiet corridors of Dolmabahçe only served to isolate the palace further from the people it claimed to lead. As the months passed following the end of the war, the logistics of power in Istanbul became increasingly absurd. The Sultan presided over a cabinet that could only pass laws with the approval of the Allied High Commissioners. Meanwhile, in Ankara, a new Grand National Assembly was passing its own laws, collecting its own taxes, and fielding its own army. This was a classic institutional duplication. Turkey had two governments, two capitals, and two identities. What quietly determined the outcome was the military success of the nationalists. When Atatürk's forces defeated the Greek army in the Great Offensive of 1922, the political capital of the Sultanate was completely spent. The foreign powers, realizing that the real power lay in Ankara, began to negotiate with the nationalists, leaving Mehmed VI as a vestigial organ in a body that had already evolved. On the surface, the Sultan's daily life remained unchanged during this period of decline. He still took his Friday prayers at the Hamidiye Mosque, and he still received foreign dignitaries in the crystal-laden halls of the palace. But beneath all of this was a pervasive sense of dread among the palace staff. The thousands of employees, from the high-ranking chamberlains to the lowliest gardeners, were aware that the funds for the court were drying up. The imperial treasury was empty, and the palace was increasingly reliant on loans and the tolerance of the British military authorities. The real tension lay in the silence of the palace. The lively discussions and complex intrigues that had once defined Ottoman politics had been replaced by a heavy, expectant stillness. Everyone was waiting for a final word from Ankara. Slowly, the legal framework for the abolition of the monarchy began to take shape. On November 1, 1922, the Grand National Assembly in Ankara passed a law that officially separated the Sultanate from the Caliphate. They declared the Sultanate abolished, while keeping the Caliphate as a purely symbolic religious office. This was a sophisticated piece of political surgery. By removing the Sultan's temporal power, the nationalists were stripping the palace of its reason for being. Mehmed VI was informed of this decision while he was in his private quarters. From a distance, it might seem that he would have fought back, but the deeper issue was that he had no one to fight with. His own guards were divided in their loyalties, and the city's population was increasingly supportive of the nationalist cause. As events unfolded over the first few weeks of November, the Sultan realized that his personal safety was no longer guaranteed. The Ankara government was calling for him to be tried for treason for his cooperation with the occupying forces. In the background, secret communications were happening between the palace and the British embassy. Mehmed VI, fearing a violent uprising or a summary execution similar to that of the Russian Tsar only a few years earlier, decided that he had to leave. This was not a decision made in a moment of panic, but a calculated response to the collapse of his institutional protection. He was a man who understood that, when the logic of the state changes, the person who represents the old logic must either disappear or be destroyed. In simple terms, the Sultan's departure was a logistical operation disguised as a flight for safety. On the night of November 16th, the Sultan gathered a small group of his closest associates, including his young son and his private secretary. He chose to leave behind the vast majority of the imperial family and the palace staff, realizing that a large group would be impossible to move secretly. The real tension lay in the packing of his personal belongings. He did not take the crown jewels or the treasures of the empire. He took his personal papers, some family mementos, and a small amount of cash. This was the behavior of a man who knew he was leaving forever. The dynasty that had once commanded 3 continents was now reduced to a few suitcases in a quiet hallway. At this stage, the British role was crucial. General Charles Harrington, the commander of the Allied forces in Istanbul, had received a formal request from the Sultan for asylum. Harrington, operating under the constraints of a delicate diplomatic situation, agreed to facilitate the departure. He chose the HMS Malaya, a British battleship that happened to be in the harbor, as the vessel for the Sultan's escape. What quietly determined the outcome was the need for secrecy. If the nationalist supporters in the city learned that the Sultan was leaving on a British ship, it could have sparked a riot or a final, bloody confrontation. The departure had to happen in the pre-dawn hours, under the cover of the morning mist that often blankets the Bosphorus in late autumn. Gradually, the palace prepared for its final imperial exit. The Sultan spent his last night in Dolmabahçe in his private suite. It is often misunderstood as a night of deep mourning, but those who were there described it more as a night of resigned exhaustion. The Sultan was an old man, and the burden of the last 4 years had been immense. Beneath all of this was the realization that the Ottoman project, as a multi-ethnic and multi-religious empire, had simply reached its terminal point. The world of the 20th century was one of borders and passports, of national languages and secular laws. There was no room left for a shadow of God on earth in a world of parliamentary majorities. On the surface, the morning of November 17, 1922, appeared like any other. A light rain was falling on the stone quays of the palace. But at 6 a.m., a small group of British soldiers arrived at a side entrance of the palace, known as the Glass Door. The Sultan, dressed in a simple Western-style coat and a fez, walked out of his home for the last time. He did not leave from the grand ceremonial gate, but through a service entrance, escorted by General Harrington's aide-de-camp. The real tension lay in the physical act of stepping into the British motor launch. As the boat pulled away from the quay and headed toward the HMS Malaya, the Sultan reportedly did not look back at the palace. He sat quietly, a man who had finally been relieved of a crown that had become a millstone. The HMS Malaya was a powerful symbol of the era. It was a battleship that had been paid for by the Federated Malay States, a reminder of the global reach of the British Empire. For the Sultan, boarding this ship was an act of supreme irony. The leader of the Islamic world was seeking refuge on a vessel that represented the very imperial power that had helped dismantle his own. As the ship weighed anchor and began its journey toward Malta, the news of his departure had not yet broken in the city. The palace staff woke up to find the imperial quarters empty. The silence that had plagued the corridors for months was now total. The Ottoman court had not been conquered in a battle, it had simply ceased to be. Over time, the significance of this quiet exit would become clearer. It was the end of the longest-running continuous dynasty in the Western and Islamic worlds. The Ottoman family had ruled for 623 years, surviving through the Middle Ages, the Renaissance, and the Industrial Revolution. Their end was not marked by a grand explosion, but by a discreet boat ride in the rain. This transition is a perfect example of how systems fail when they can no longer adapt to their environment. The Sultanate was a system designed for expansion and conquest. In an era of contraction and nationalism, it had no moves left to make. The quiet corridors of Dolmabahçe remained, but the spirit that had animated them had moved on to the new Turkey being built in the Anatolian highlands. In the background, the news of the Sultan's departure finally reached Ankara. Mustafa Kemal Atatürk and the nationalist leaders received the news with a mixture of relief and strategic calculation. The escape of the Sultan on a British ship allowed them to frame him as a traitor who had abandoned his people to the enemy. This provided the final moral justification for the permanent abolition of the monarchy. The real tension lay in the fact that the Sultan was still the caliph. While the temporal sultanate was dead, the religious office remained, and for a short time, the nationalists appointed Mehmed VI's cousin, Abdülmecid Roman II, as a purely religious caliph. But the logic of the secular republic was already moving toward the final abolition of the caliphate as well, a move that would be completed only 2 years later. As the HMS Malaya moved away from the Golden Horn, the immediate logistical problem facing the remaining Ottoman administration was how to present this disappearance to the public. On the surface, the palace was still occupied by the extensive family of the Sultan, the harem, and hundreds of retainers who had no clear instruction on what to do next. The deeper issue was that the legal fiction of the Ottoman state had been decapitated. For over 600 years, the person of the Sultan had been the focal point of all law, religious authority, and social order. Now, the seat was physically empty. Gradually, the news began to filter out through the telegraph wires and the morning newspapers. Wahid ad-Din had fled. In simple terms, this word was used by the nationalist press to strip the Sultan of his remaining dignity, transforming a strategic retreat into an act of desertion. What quietly determined the outcome in the days following the departure was the reaction of the Grand National Assembly in Ankara. At a superficial level, they could have simply declared a republic immediately, but the real tension lay in the religious sensitivities of the population. Large segments of the Anatolian heartland and the wider Islamic world still viewed the Ottoman house as the rightful custodians of the caliphate. Slowly, the leaders in Ankara realized they needed a transitional phase to move from a monarchical system to a national one without sparking a religious civil war. As events unfolded, they decided to appoint a new caliph who would hold no political power, a purely spiritual figurehead who would reside in Istanbul, while the government ruled from Ankara. The choice fell upon Abdülmecid Efendi, the cousin of the departed Sultan, and a man known for his refined tastes in painting and music. It may seem that this was a return to tradition, but the deeper issue was that Abdülmecid was being placed in an impossible systemic position. He was to be a caliph of all Muslims, but he was forbidden from wearing a uniform, issuing political decrees, or even having a formal coronation ceremony. In the background, the nationalists were watching his every move, ready to interpret any sign of traditional imperial pomp as a threat to the new sovereignty of the people. This was the birth of the caliphate without a sultanate, a short-lived institutional experiment that attempted to separate the sacred from the secular in a society where the two had been fused for centuries. As the months passed, the atmosphere inside Dolmabahçe Palace shifted from the anxiety of the final sultan's reign to a kind of surreal, quiet stagnation. Abdülmecid Roman II was an artist by temperament, and he spent much of his time in his studio overlooking the Bosphorus. At a superficial level, he was the head of the Ottoman house, but the real tension lay in his lack of a budget. The new government in Ankara had seized the imperial estates and restricted the caliph's allowance to a fraction of what was required to maintain the palace. Slowly, the grand halls began to show signs of neglect. The heating was turned off in many wings, and the number of servants was drastically reduced. The real tension lay in the contrast between the baroque splendor of the surroundings and the increasingly threadbare reality of the inhabitants' lives. At this stage, the international community was watching the experiment with skepticism. In British-controlled India and the various Arab lands, the caliphate question was a major logistical and political concern. From a distance, it might appear that the Islamic world would rally to the support of the new caliph in Istanbul. However, the deeper issue was that the First World War had shattered the concept of pan-Islamic unity. Most regions were now focused on their own national struggles against colonial rule. In simple terms, the caliphate had become a symbol without a mechanism for action. The real tension lay in the fact that, while Abdülmecid received letters of support from across the globe, he could not even pay the salaries of his personal secretaries without the approval of a government in Ankara that viewed him with increasing hostility. Beneath all of this, was the growing personal friction between Abdülmecid and Mustafa Kemal. As events unfolded, the new caliph began to behave in ways that suggested he still viewed himself as a royal peer to the leaders in Ankara. He would ride through the streets of Istanbul in a grand carriage during the Friday processions, and he continued to receive foreign diplomats as if he were a head of state. At the core of the conflict was a dispute over protocol. Every time Abdülmecid signed a document or hosted a dinner, the nationalists saw a shadow of the old sultanate trying to re-emerge. Gradually, the press in Ankara began to attack the caliph, describing him as a luxury that the young, struggling nation could no longer afford. As the year 1923 progressed, the logistics of the Turkish state were formally redefined by the Treaty of Lausanne and the official declaration of the Republic. On October 29, 1923, Ankara was declared the capital of the Republic of Turkey, and Mustafa Kemal was elected its first president. From a distance, this seemed to resolve the political question, but the real tension lay in the continued existence of the caliph in Istanbul. The caliphate had become a state within a state, a rival center of prestige that attracted those who were unhappy with the secular reforms being pushed from Ankara. Beneath all of this was a fundamental systemic mismatch. A secular republic and a traditional caliphate could not share the same national identity. What quietly determined the outcome was a specific incident involving two prominent Indian Muslim leaders, the Aga Khan and Emir Ali. They sent a letter to the Turkish government urging that the caliphate be preserved and respected. On the surface, this was a gesture of religious solidarity. However, the deeper issue was that the letter was published in the Turkish newspapers before it even reached the government in Ankara. The nationalists interpreted this as foreign interference in Turkish domestic affairs, orchestrated by the palace in Istanbul. Slowly, this event became the catalyst for the final move. The real tension lay in the fact that the caliphate, intended as a symbol of unity, had become a lightning rod for political division and foreign suspicion. As the months passed toward the spring of 1924, the rhetoric from Ankara became definitive. In simple terms, the government decided that the caliphate had to go. The real tension lay in the speed with which the final blow was delivered. On March 3, 1924, the Grand National Assembly passed a series of laws that abolished the caliphate, exiled all members of the Ottoman dynasty, and confiscated their remaining properties. This was the final logistical termination of the Ottoman presence in Turkey. The law was passed in the afternoon, and by that evening, the governor of Istanbul had been instructed to ensure that Abdülmecid and his family were removed from the palace immediately. On the surface, the eviction of the last caliph was more abrupt than that of the last sultan. At a superficial level, the authorities wanted to prevent any public demonstration of support for the family. In the background, police cordons were placed around Dolmabahçe Palace, and the telephone lines were cut. Abdülmecid was given only a few hours to pack his belongings. The real tension lay in the dignity of the departure. Unlike the last sultan, who had left on a British battleship, the last caliph was taken by car to the small railway station of Çatalca, on the outskirts of the city, to board the Orient Express. He was given a small envelope of cash, some of it provided by the personal funds of the local officials who felt a lingering sense of respect, and sent across the border into Switzerland. Gradually, the palace was emptied of its human history. In the background, the hundreds of women of the harem and the various palace attendants were given a deadline to leave. Many had nowhere to go, having lived their entire lives within the walls of the palace. The deeper issue was the sudden collapse of a social ecosystem. The Ottoman court was not just a political body, it was a complex network of families, traditions, and livelihoods. When the dynasty was exiled, this entire system was left to dissolve. The real tension lay in the silence that followed. The palace, once the most crowded and busy building in the city, became a museum overnight. The crystal chandeliers were covered in dust sheets, and the grand doors were locked by the new Republican authorities. What truly shaped the outcome was the efficiency of the Republican transition. Unlike other revolutions that left a lingering monarchist movement, the Turkish abolition was absolute and geographically final. By exiling every single member of the dynasty, men, women, and children, the nationalists ensured that there was no pretender left on Turkish soil. The real tension lay in the suddenness of the displacement. Members of the family found themselves in hotels in Paris, Nice, or Cairo, often with no means of support and no understanding of how to live as private citizens. The dynasty that had once owned all of Turkey was now a collection of refugees scattered across the Mediterranean. Slowly, the city of Istanbul began to adapt to its new status as a provincial city. At a superficial level, the removal of the court meant the end of the city's role as the center of the world. The real tension lay in the loss of the imperial identity. The grand mansions of the pashas along the Bosphorus were sold or fell into ruin, and the vast administrative buildings of the Sublime Porte were repurposed for the needs of the Republic. Beneath all of this was the birth of a new, national pride centered on the Anatolian plateau. The quiet corridors of the palace were no longer the place where history was made. History was now being written in the modern, austere offices of Ankara. In simple terms, the final day of the Ottoman court was the day the logic of the nation-state finally defeated the logic of the empire. The real tension lay in the fact that the empire had lived on as a ghost for years after its actual death. The departure of the Sultan in 1922 and the Caliph in 1924 were merely the final acts of clearing the stage. As the train carrying Abdülmecid Roman II crossed the border, the Ottoman era reached its absolute terminal point. The shadow of God had vanished, leaving only the bright, clear light of a secular republic. The transition was complete, and the quiet observation of the historians began. The transition of the Ottoman family from the sovereign masters of an empire to stateless refugees in Europe remains one of the most striking examples of systemic displacement in the 20th century. On the surface, it might appear that the exile was a personal tragedy for the members of the House of Osman, but at the core of the conflict was a much larger logistical reality. The new republic could not allow any competing source of legitimacy to remain within its borders. When the law of March 3, 1924 was enacted, it did not just target the caliph. It applied to every man, woman, and child of the imperial bloodline. They were given between 24 hours and 10 days to leave the country. Gradually, the grand hotels of Europe, from the Majestic in Nice to the Adlon in Berlin, became the temporary courts of a dynasty that no longer possessed a country. What truly shaped the outcome was the sudden loss of the imperial financial network. In the background, the Ottoman dynasty had always functioned as a complex economic entity, with its wealth tied to state lands, religious endowments, and an intricate system of palace allowances. When the Republican government confiscated these assets, the exiles were left with only what they could carry in their personal luggage. The real tension lay in the immediate devaluation of their social capital. In Istanbul, a prince or a princess was a figure of supreme authority. In a hotel in Switzerland or France, they were merely guests with increasingly unpaid bills. Slowly, the jewelry and personal mementos that had been smuggled out were sold to pay for basic necessities, a process that mirrored the slow dissolution of the family's internal cohesion. As the months passed, the former caliph, Abdulmecid Roman II, settled in Nice on the French Riviera. It may seem that his life there was one of leisure, but at a superficial level, he was attempting to maintain a caliphate in exile. He continued to hold audiences and receive letters from Muslims across the globe who refused to accept the abolition of the office. The real tension lay in his lack of any actual administrative power. He was a leader without a bureaucracy, a priest without a mosque. Beneath all of this was the watchful eye of the French and British intelligence services, who were concerned that the presence of the caliph could spark anti-colonial unrest in their own territories. The quiet corridors of Dolmabahçe had been replaced by the breezy balconies of a Mediterranean villa, yet the feeling of being in a gilded cage remained. In simple terms, the exiled family faced a profound identity crisis. For centuries, their identity had been defined by their service to the state and their role as the shadow of God. In the background of European society, they were often viewed with a mixture of curiosity and pity. Some members of the family sought to integrate, marrying into other displaced noble houses or finding work in the arts and business. Others, however, remained trapped in a perpetual state of waiting, convinced that the Republic would eventually fail and they would be called back to restore order. The real tension lay in the generational divide. While the older members mourned the loss of the empire, the younger generation was forced to learn the practical logistics of survival in a modern secular world where their titles held no legal weight. At this stage, the fate of the Dolmabahçe Palace back in Istanbul took a fascinating turn. From a distance, it might appear that the new republic would want to destroy the symbol of the old regime. However, at the core of the conflict was the need for the republic to establish its own historical narrative. Mustafa Kemal Atatürk recognized that the palace, while a symbol of the Sultanate, was also a masterpiece of Turkish craftsmanship and a repository of the nation's history. Slowly, the palace was preserved not as a home for kings, but as a museum of the state and a residence for the president. The real tension lay in the change of use. The grand halls that had once hosted imperial receptions were now used for the meetings of the Republican cabinet. This was a physical manifestation of the systemic capture of Ottoman history by the new national identity. What quietly determined the outcome for the palace's preservation was its role in the secularization project. By turning the palace into a public museum, the government was stripping the space of its aura of sacred mystery. On the surface, the public was invited to walk through the harem and the selamlik, seeing for themselves the extravagance that had supposedly led to the empire's bankruptcy. This was a form of educational theater. The real tension lay in the fact that the palace was being used to justify its own vacancy. In the background, the new authorities were careful to maintain the structure's grandeur, as it reflected the power and the sophistication of the Turkish people, regardless of the government in power. The palace had transitioned from a living heart of an empire to a silent witness of its end. Gradually, the logistical reality of the exiles became even more desperate as the global economy shifted toward the Great Depression. As events unfolded, many members of the Ottoman family found themselves in genuine poverty. At a superficial level, they were still imperial highnesses, but the deeper issue was that they were often unable to afford the cost of a simple meal. Stories began to emerge of princesses working as seamstresses in Paris, or princes serving as taxi drivers in Cairo. The real tension lay in the loss of the domestic ecosystem that had supported them for centuries. In the palace, every need had been anticipated by a specialized staff. In exile, the simplest tasks of daily life, buying food, paying rent, navigating bureaucracy, became overwhelming hurdles for those who had never been trained to face them. Beneath all of this was the changing political landscape of the Middle East. At the core of the conflict in the 1930s was the emergence of new Arab monarchies, such as the Saudis in the Hejaz and the Hashemites in Iraq and Jordan. These new rulers had no desire to see a restoration of the Ottoman Caliphate, as it would threaten their own regional legitimacy. Slowly, the international support for Abdulmecid Roman II began to dry up. The real tension lay in the fact that the Ottoman name, once a symbol of universal Islamic leadership, had become a relic of a vanished age. The quiet corridors of history were now being filled by the voices of new nationalist and pan-Arab movements that had no place for the old imperial family. As the months passed leading up to World War II, the Ottoman exiles became even more isolated. In simple terms, the world was preparing for a new kind of total war, and the grievances of a displaced dynasty from the previous century seemed increasingly irrelevant. At this stage, some members of the family attempted to return to Turkey, petitioning the government for the right to die in their homeland. The real tension lay in the Republic's refusal. For Ataturk and his successors, the exile had to be permanent to ensure that the ghost of the Sultanate never returned. It was only much later, in the 1950s for women and the 1970s for men, that the members of the family were finally allowed to set foot on Turkish soil again as private citizens. Over time, the Dolmabahçe Palace became the final residence of Mustafa Kemal Ataturk himself. This was a move of profound symbolic weight. At a superficial level, he was using the palace as a convenient residence while in Istanbul. However, the deeper issue was that he was occupying the seat of the old authority to prove that the new authority was superior. He chose to live and work in a relatively small room in the former harem section, rather than the grand imperial suites. The real tension lay in the physical presence of the revolutionary in the house of the monarch. When Ataturk died in the palace on November 10, 1938, the clock in his bedroom was stopped at 9:05 a.m., the moment of his death. This clock remains at that time today, a silent marker of the moment the father of the Republic left the halls of the Sultan. What truly shaped the outcome of the Ottoman legacy was the way the family eventually accepted their new reality. Slowly, the narrative of the evil Sultan began to soften in the Turkish public consciousness, replaced by a more nuanced understanding of the dynasty as part of the long continuity of Turkish history. The real tension lay in the eventual reconciliation. In the background, the descendants of the sultans began to visit the palaces as tourists, paying admission fees to enter the rooms where their grandparents had once ruled. This was the final logical conclusion of the systemic shift. The dynasty was no longer a threat, it was heritage. The quiet corridors were now filled with the voices of schoolchildren and international visitors, learning about a past that had been safely contained within the walls of a museum. In simple terms, the end of the Ottoman court was not just the end of a family's power, but the end of a specific way of organizing the world. The real tension lay in the transition from the sacred and the imperial to the national and the historical. The decision to exile the family was a logistical necessity for the birth of the Republic, a harsh but effective move to ensure that the old system could never be rebooted. As events unfolded over the decades, the members of the House of Osman became a global diaspora, a living reminder of the fragility of even the most ancient and powerful systems. Their story is a quiet observation on the nature of time and the relentless movement of political evolution. At a superficial level, we might view the empty throne in the Dolmabahçe Palace as a symbol of loss. But beneath all of this is the realization that the throne had been empty of power long before the Sultan actually left. The logistics of the modern world had moved on, and the palace had become a monument to an idea that could no longer be sustained. The quiet corridors are a place for intellectual relaxation, where one can reflect on the causes and constraints that shape the rise and fall of civilizations. The Ottoman era reached its terminal point not because of a single mistake, but because the very foundations of the world had shifted beneath it, leaving the palace on the Bosphorus as a beautiful, silent shell. On the surface, the departure of the Sultan and the later exile of the Caliph left the Dolmabahçe Palace as a silent monument of stone and glass. However, what truly shaped the outcome of those final days was the sudden and overwhelming question of what to do with the thousands of human beings who had made up the imperial household. In simple terms, a palace of that scale was not just a residence. It was a self-contained city with its own internal economy and social hierarchy. When the head of the household was removed, the logistical support system for the eunuchs, the harem, the cooks, and the bodyguards evaporated almost overnight. As the months passed, these individuals found themselves standing in the quiet corridors of a world that had ceased to exist, waiting for a republican government to decide their fate. The real tension lay in the status of the palace staff, many of whom had no life outside the imperial walls. In the background, the Ottoman court had maintained a centuries-old tradition of bringing people into service at a young age, often through complex systems of recruitment from the edges of the empire. By now, these men and women were aging into a society that was rapidly secularizing and adopting Western norms. For the senior eunuchs, who had once held immense political and domestic power, the transition was particularly stark. At a superficial level, they were seen as relics of an archaic age. Gradually, they were forced to leave the palace with small pensions, often moving into modest apartments in the suburbs of Istanbul, carrying with them the secrets of a court that the public was now curious to exploit. Slowly, the attention of the new government turned toward the physical contents of the palace. It may seem that the furniture and the art were the primary concern, but the deeper issue was the massive accumulation of paperwork. At the core of the conflict was the Sublime Porte, the administrative heart of the empire that had generated millions of documents over 6 centuries. As events unfolded, the Republican authorities realized that they had inherited one of the largest and most complex archives in human history. These papers were not just old letters, they were the land deeds, tax records, and legal treaties for a dozen modern nations. What quietly determined the outcome of Turkey's administrative transition was the Herculean task of organizing these records while the city around them was being stripped of its imperial status. Over time, the handling of the harem became a point of significant public fascination and political sensitivity. It might appear that the women of the palace were simply released, but the real tension lay in their total lack of legal standing in the new republic. Many of the younger women were eventually reunited with distant family members or married into the new Turkish middle class. But for the older members of the harem, the quiet corridors of Dolmabahçe had been their entire universe. Beneath all of this was the Republic's desire to modernize the image of the Turkish woman. The harem was framed by the new authorities as a symbol of Oriental backwardness, and as events unfolded, the forced dispersal of its inhabitants became a powerful narrative tool to show that the old Turkey was truly gone. In simple terms, the logistics of clearing the palace required a meticulous inventory of every object, from the 4-ton Bohemian crystal chandelier in the ceremonial hall to the silver spoons in the kitchen. In the background, the new Republican Ministry of Culture was tasked with ensuring that no treasures were smuggled out during the chaos. From a distance, this process appeared to be a standard bureaucratic audit, but the real tension lay in the shifting definition of property. What had once belonged to the Sultan personally was now defined as the heritage of the Turkish nation. This was a fundamental systemic shift. The wealth of the monarchy was being recoded as the capital of the people. Slowly, the palace was transformed into a national vault, where the history of the Ottomans was preserved in a state of frozen animation. The deeper issue during these years was the survival of the bureaucracy itself. It might appear that the fall of the Sultan meant the total destruction of the Ottoman ruling class. However, what truly shaped the outcome was the fact that the new republic could not function without the expertise of the old clerks and administrators. As the months passed, the middle-ranking officials of the Sultanate began to migrate to Ankara, bringing with them the administrative habits and the procedural knowledge of the empire. Beneath all of this was a hidden continuity. While the name of the state had changed and the monarch was gone, the logistical DNA of the Ottoman administration persisted within the new Turkish Republic. The quiet corridors of power had moved inland, but the ghosts of the old system were still typing the letters and filing the reports. At a superficial level, the public was eager to see inside the palace doors that had been closed for so long. As events unfolded, the first public tours were organized, allowing ordinary citizens to walk through the grand halls and peek into the private rooms of the Sultan. This was a moment of profound psychological transition. What quietly determined the outcome was the realization that the shadow of God had lived a life of tangible, earthly luxury. By making the palace accessible, the Republic was demystifying the monarchy. The real tension lay in the mixture of awe and resentment that the visitors felt. They saw the golden gilding and the silk carpets, but they also saw the empty throne, which served as a silent reminder that the era of divine right was over. In the background, the fate of the imperial libraries was a priority for the scholars of the new age. It may seem that these were just collections of books, but at the core of the conflict was the cultural identity of the nation. The Ottoman libraries contained thousands of rare manuscripts in Arabic, Persian, and Ottoman Turkish languages that the new republic was soon to sideline in favor of a Latin-based alphabet. Slowly, the logistics of translating and preserving this knowledge became a race against time. The real tension lay in the fear that the wisdom of the past would become inaccessible to the generations of the future. The quiet corridors of the library became a sanctuary for the linguists and historians who were tasked with bridging the gap between the old imperial script and the new national tongue. As the months passed toward the late 1920s, the palace began to settle into its new identity as a state guest house. From a distance, it seemed that the grand receptions of the past had returned, but the real tension lay in the nature of the guests. Instead of tributary kings and imperial envoys, the palace now hosted the diplomats of modern republics and the leaders of revolutionary movements. Beneath all of this was the influence of Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, who used the palace as a stage to prove that Turkey was a modern European power. He would host grand balls and dinners in the halls where the sultans had once sat in seclusion. This was a deliberate use of the old architecture to frame a new kind of social behavior. The palace was being taught a new language, one of secularism and international diplomacy. What truly shaped the outcome for the remaining palace servants was the creation of a special pension fund. In simple terms, the government realized it could not simply cast thousands of people into the street without risking social unrest. Gradually, the lower-level staff, the guards, the boatmen, and the cleaners were integrated into the new Republican civil service. The real tension lay in the loss of their traditional identity. They were no longer servants of the Sultan, but employees of the state. At a superficial level, their daily work remained the same, but the deeper issue was the loss of the personal bond that had characterized Ottoman service. The logic of the modern state was cold and impersonal, and for those who had lived under the patronage of a dynasty, the change felt like a loss of family. As events unfolded, the city of Istanbul itself had to find a new reason for being. It might appear that the loss of the capital was a death blow to the city's prestige. However, the real tension lay in the emergence of Istanbul as the cultural and economic lung of the new Turkey. While the quiet corridors of the palace were preserved, the streets of the city were filled with new businesses, schools, and theaters. The deeper issue was the transition from a city of the court to a city of the citizens. The Bosphorus was no longer a private imperial waterway, but a bustling artery of trade and recreation. Slowly, the shadow of the palace began to shrink as the vibrant life of the Republic grew around it. At the core of the conflict during this period was the physical maintenance of the Dolmabahçe Palace. Beneath all of this was a logistical nightmare. The building was constructed on reclaimed land and was constantly threatened by the salt air and the shifting foundations. The real tension lay in the cost of upkeep. The Republic, struggling to modernize its infrastructure and industry, had to justify spending millions of liras on the preservation of a building it had rejected. What quietly determined the outcome was the decision to view the palace as national capital. It was seen as an asset that attracted international prestige and tourist revenue. The logic of the museum had replaced the logic of the court, and the palace was saved because it had become a profitable piece of history. In simple terms, the end of the Ottoman court was a process of archiving. Everything that had once been alive and volatile, the politics, the people, the power, was being categorized, numbered, and put behind glass. In the background, the memory of the final day became a foundational myth for the new state, a story of a narrow escape from a failing past into a bright national future. The real tension lay in the fact that the past was never truly gone. It was just stored in the basement. As the months passed, the quiet corridors of Dolmabahçe became a place where the modern Turk could go to see where they had come from and to feel a sense of relief that they were no longer there. Gradually, the narrative of the last sultan's departure and the caliph's exile was refined into a smooth, logical progression. It may seem that the transition was seamless, but at a superficial level, it was a period of immense human complexity and systemic stress. What truly shaped the outcome was the ability of the new government to capture the machinery of the old state without being consumed by it. The palace remained standing, the archives were preserved, and the bureaucracy continued, but the soul of the building had been replaced. The silence of the palace was not the silence of a tomb, but the silence of a library, a place where the books are closed, the lights are dimmed, and the lessons of the past are waiting for anyone who chooses to listen. The quiet observation that ends this part of our journey is the realization that the Dolmabahçe Palace had fulfilled its final mission. It had acted as the stage for the transition, the container for the final hours of a 600-year-old dream. By the late 1920s, the quiet corridors were no longer a place of dread or expectation. They were a place of reflection. The Sultan was in San Remo, the Caliph was in Nice, and the Turkish people were in the streets of their new republic. The logic of the monarchy had been archived, and the logic of the nation was in full bloom. The transition was complete, and the palace on the Bosphorus remained, a beautiful, silent witness to the end of an era. The transformation of the former Ottoman subjects into Turkish citizens was not merely a matter of changing passports. It was a fundamental rewiring of the collective social psyche. On the surface, the end of the monarchy in 1922 and the caliphate in 1924 had cleared the political stage, but the real tension lay in the deeply ingrained habits of daily life that had been cultivated over centuries of imperial rule. To build a modern republic, the leadership in Ankara realized that they had to intervene in the most intimate aspects of human existence: how people spoke, how they wrote, how they dressed, and how they identified themselves within a community. What quietly determined the outcome of this social revolution was the speed and systematic nature of the reforms introduced throughout the 1920s and 30s, designed to sever the cultural umbilical cord connecting the Turkish people to their Ottoman past. In simple terms, the most profound of these changes was the alphabet reform of 1928. For over a millennium, the Turkish language had been written in a modified Arabic script, a complex system that was deeply tied to the religious and administrative traditions of the Islamic world. At a superficial level, the script was beautiful and prestigious, but the deeper issue was its logistical inefficiency for a modernizing nation. The Arabic alphabet was not naturally suited to the vowel-heavy phonetics of the Turkish tongue, which contributed to extremely low literacy rates, estimated at less than 10% in the final years of the empire. Slowly, the government moved to replace this script with a new, Latin-based alphabet. This was not just a linguistic shift. It was a systemic wall placed between the new generation and the imperial archives. Overnight, the quiet corridors of history became inaccessible to those who did not learn the old script, effectively creating a year zero for Turkish culture. The real tension lay in the suddenness of the transition. As months passed following the decree, Mustafa Kemal himself traveled the country with a blackboard and chalk, teaching the new letters in village squares and city parks. This was a form of pedagogical mobilization. Beneath all of this was the desire to align Turkey with the Western world and to simplify the logistics of education and mass communication. At the core of the conflict was the resistance of the religious and conservative elite, for whom the Arabic script was inseparable from the sacred text of the Quran. However, what quietly determined the outcome was the state's total control over the printing presses and the educational system. By making the new alphabet the only legal script for business and government, the Republic ensured that the old world would literally become unreadable within a single generation. As events unfolded, The reform of the legal system proved to be equally disruptive to the old Ottoman order. Under the Sultanate, the law was a pluralistic and often confusing mix of Sharia, religious law, and various secular decrees known as canon. In simple terms, your legal rights depended largely on your religious community. In 1926, the Republic abolished this entire system in favor of a new civil code based on Swiss law and a penal code based on Italian models. The real tension lay in the total secularization of marriage, inheritance, and divorce. For centuries, these had been the exclusive domain of religious authorities. By now, the state had become the sole arbiter of private life. This was a massive act of systemic centralization, moving the quiet corridors of judgment away from the mosques and into the secular courthouses of the Republic. Slowly, the visual identity of the Turkish people was also subjected to reform. On the surface, the hat law of 1925 might seem like a trivial matter of fashion, but at a superficial level, it was a direct assault on the visual hierarchy of the Ottoman era. For decades, the fez, the red felt hat, had been the universal symbol of the Ottoman subject, designed to be worn during prayer as it allowed the forehead to touch the ground. To the nationalists, the fez was a mark of Eastern backwardness. By mandating the wearing of Western-style hats and caps, the government was physically compelling the population to adopt a European appearance. The real tension lay in the rural areas, where the hat was seen as a symbol of the infidel. What quietly determined the outcome was the state's willingness to enforce the law with harsh penalties, demonstrating that even the clothing on a citizen's back was now a matter of national policy. Beneath all of this was a fundamental shift in the concept of time and space. Gradually, the Republic moved to align Turkey with the international world by adopting the Gregorian calendar and the 24-hour clock. In the background, the Ottoman system of measuring time had been based on the prayer cycles and the lunar calendar, which often meant that the legal day varied by season and location. In simple terms, the time of the Sultan was replaced by the time of the Republic. The real tension lay in the daily rhythm of life. The call to prayer, which had once regulated the movement of the city, was now secondary to the mechanical clock and the factory whistle. This was the logistical synchronization of Turkey with the global industrial economy, a process that made the quiet corridors of the palace feel like they belonged to a different century entirely. At the core of the conflict, during the mid-1930s, was the surname law of 1934. For centuries, Ottomans had been identified by their first names, followed by their father's name or a title like Pasha, Effendi, or Bey. From a distance, this was a personal and intimate way of naming, but the deeper issue was that it was an administrative nightmare for a modern state. It was nearly impossible to track individuals for taxation, conscription, or census purposes without unique last names. Slowly, every family in Turkey was required to choose a surname. This was a moment of profound social engineering. People often chose names that reflected their professions, their geography, or nationalistic ideals like Öztürk, pure Turk. What truly shaped the outcome was the loss of the old Ottoman titles. The elite families of the court were stripped of their honorary prefixes, further leveling the social playing field and emphasizing that everyone was now equal under the eyes of the state. At a superficial level, the emancipation of women was the most visible sign of the new Turkey. In 1934, Turkish women were granted full suffrage and the right to run for political office, years before their counterparts in several European nations. Beneath all of this, was a strategic need to double the nation's intellectual and economic capacity. The real tension lay in the transition from the secluded world of the harem to the public sphere of the university and the workplace. As events unfolded, women were encouraged to remove the veil and to participate in national life as teachers, doctors, and pilots. At the core of the conflict was the resistance of traditional family structures, but what quietly determined the outcome was the personal example set by the women of the new Republican elite. The quiet corridors of the domestic space were being opened to the bright light of public service. In simple terms, the reforms of the 1920s and 30s were an attempt to create a new man and a new woman who were entirely disconnected from the imperial legacy. In the background, the educational system was unified under the law of integration of education, which closed the religious madrasas and replaced them with secular national schools. The real tension lay in the curriculum. Instead of learning about the triumphs of the sultans as the defenders of the faith, students were taught about the ancient origins of the Turkish people and the heroic struggle for national independence. Gradually, the memory of the Ottoman court was being pushed into the realm of archaeology. The deeper issue was that the state was now the primary source of moral and intellectual authority, a role that had once been shared by the Sultan and the religious establishment. On the surface, the city of Istanbul had to physically adapt to these changes. The grand mosque complexes, which had once functioned as schools, hospitals, and soup kitchens, found their endowments seized by the state. The real tension lay in the decay of the city's religious infrastructure. Some mosques were converted into warehouses or museums, while others were left to struggle as their traditional sources of income disappeared. Slowly, the focus of urban life shifted from the mosque courtyard to the public square and the school building. Beneath all of this was the emergence of a new architectural style, Republican modernism. The sleek, functional buildings of the new bureaucracy stood in stark contrast to the ornate, heavy structures of the Ottoman past. The quiet corridors were now made of concrete and glass, rather than marble and carved wood. What quietly determined the outcome of these years was the sheer exhaustion of the population. After a decade of near-constant warfare, from 1912 to 1922, most Turks were willing to accept any system that offered peace and progress. The deeper issue was that the Republican reforms were not just ideological, they were practical. They promised, and often delivered, better sanitation, modern medicine, and a path out of the stagnant agrarian economy of the late empire. The real tension lay in the loss of cultural continuity, but for many, this was a price worth paying for the promise of a stable future. In simple terms, the Republic was winning the war of the mind by proving that the old Ottoman ways had failed to protect the people, while the new ways offered a chance at survival in a dangerous world. As the months passed toward the end of the 1930s, the quiet corridors of the Dolmabahçe Palace had become a repository for a vanished civilization. The people walking through the halls were no longer subjects looking at their master, they were citizens looking at a museum. The deeper issue was that the internal operating system of the Turkish people had been successfully updated. The logic of the nation had superseded the logic of the dynasty. Even in the rural villages, where the reforms were slower to take hold, the state was now a pervasive presence through the teacher, the policeman, and the tax collector. The real tension lay in the pockets of resistance that remained, but these were increasingly isolated and uncoordinated. The transition was not perfect, but it was irreversible. What truly shaped the outcome was the absence of a viable alternative. With the Ottoman family in exile and the religious leadership silenced, there was no other institution capable of challenging the Republican narrative. Slowly, even the most traditional families began to send their children to the new schools and to adopt the new alphabet. The real tension lay in the private spheres of the home, where the old language and the old prayers were still whispered, but the public sphere belonged entirely to the Republic. The quiet corridors of the heart still held onto the past, but the quiet corridors of the world had moved on. As the 1930s progressed, the quiet corridors of the Dolmabahçe Palace stood in stark contrast to the frantic construction occurring hundreds of miles inland in the new capital of Ankara. On the surface, the Republic had won its internal battle for sovereignty, but the real tension lay in the immense logistical vacuum left by the collapse of the Ottoman economic system. For centuries, the empire's economy had been dominated by foreign concessions, a massive external debt, and a lack of indigenous industry. The new government realized that political independence was a fragile shell without economic self-sufficiency. Slowly, the focus of the nation shifted from social reform to statism, a systemic approach where the state became the primary entrepreneur, investor, and industrial planner. This was a move of necessity. There was no private bourgeoisie with enough capital to build the factories, railroads, and mines that the modern nation required. What truly shaped the outcome of this decade was the first five-year industrial plan, launched in 1934. In simple terms, Turkey sought to end its dependence on imported basic goods by building its own production capacity. Beneath all of this was the help of Soviet advisors and Western machinery, a pragmatic blend of logistical support that ignored ideological boundaries in favor of national growth. Gradually, huge textile mills in Kayseri, paper mills in Izmit, and ironworks in Karabük began to rise from the Anatolian soil. At the core of the conflict was the difficulty of training a largely agrarian population to work in a disciplined, industrial environment. The real tension lay in the transition from the seasonal rhythm of the farm to the relentless schedule of the factory. This was the birth of the Turkish working class, a group whose identity was formed not by imperial guilds, but by state-owned enterprises. In simple terms, the logistics of these new industries were tied to a massive expansion of the railway network. At a superficial level, the Ottoman railways had been built by foreign companies to serve their own export interests, primarily connecting the coast to the interior. The Republic's goal was to create an iron network that linked the various regions of Anatolia into a single, integrated domestic market. In the background, the slogan, "We have woven the motherland with iron nets from four ends," became a central pillar of national pride. This was a systemic reversal of the Ottoman peripheral economy. By now, the flow of goods and people was directed toward Ankara and the new industrial centers, rather than toward the ports controlled by foreign powers. The quiet corridors of the palace were physically bypassed by the steam engines of the new age, which carried the raw materials and the hopes of a secular, industrial future. As the months passed toward the late 1930s, the Republic faced the looming threat of another global conflict. The deeper issue was that Turkey was a middle power positioned at the most strategic crossroads in the world, controlling the Bosphorus and the Dardanelles. At this stage, the memory of the disastrous Ottoman entry into the First World War was a primary constraint on Turkish diplomacy. The leadership, led by Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, and later İsmet İnönü, pursued a policy of active neutrality. The real tension lay in the constant pressure from the great powers. Germany was Turkey's largest trading partner, Britain was its primary source of security guarantees, and the Soviet Union was a powerful, unpredictable neighbor to the north. Turkey's survival depended on a delicate logistical balancing act, staying close enough to the powers to receive modern weaponry, but far enough away to avoid being dragged into their battles. Slowly, the military logistics of the country were modernized in anticipation of the coming storm. At a superficial level, the Turkish army was still largely an infantry force, but beneath all of this was a massive investment in fortifying the Thracian border and the Dardanelles. The real tension lay in the cost of this mobilization. The young republic was forced to divert its scarce industrial resources away from development and toward defense. In simple terms, the choice was between bread or bullets. As events unfolded, the government introduced a series of harsh economic measures, including the wealth tax and the national defense law, which allowed the state to seize resources for the military. This was a moment of systemic stress that tested the loyalty of the citizens who had only recently been created by the Republican reforms. At the core of the conflict during this period was the death of Mustafa Kemal Atatürk in 1938. On the surface, his passing was a moment of national mourning, but the deeper issue was the transition from a charismatic leadership to an institutional one. As the news broke from Dolmabahçe Palace, many feared that the republic would fragment without its founding father. What quietly determined the outcome was the seamless transfer of power to İsmet İnönü. The quiet corridors of the palace were once again the site of a historic shift, but this time, the transition followed a predetermined constitutional path. This was the ultimate proof that the republic's systemic reforms had taken root. The state was now more than just the person of its leader. The logic of the institution had finally superseded the logic of the hero. In simple terms, the start of World War II in 1939 placed Turkey in an impossible logistical bind. At this stage, the Mediterranean became a war zone, and the traditional trade routes were severed. The real tension lay in the food supply. While the state was building factories, it had not yet fully modernized its agriculture. Gradually, the country faced shortages and hyperinflation. In the background, the government had to manage a massive standing army of over 1 million men, which further drained the rural labor force. Beneath all of this was the shadow of the Sevres Treaty, the fear that a defeat or an occupation would lead to the final partition of the Turkish homeland. This existential anxiety drove every decision made in the darkened offices of Ankara, far away from the ornate, vulnerable halls of Istanbul. As events unfolded throughout the early 1940s, Turkey became a master of diplomatic procrastination. It signed a treaty with Britain and France, followed by a non-aggression pact with Nazi Germany just days before the invasion of the Soviet Union. From a distance, this looks like opportunism, but the deeper issue was the logistical reality that Turkey could not withstand an invasion from either side. At a superficial level, the country was a neutral observer, but the real tension lay in the secret war happening on Turkish soil. Istanbul became a nest of spies, where agents from all sides exchanged information and plotted in the city's grand hotels. The quiet corridors of the former Ottoman capital were now the backdrop for the most sophisticated intelligence-gathering operation in the world. What truly shaped the outcome of the war years for Turkey was its control over chrome. In simple terms, chrome was a vital mineral for the production of high-grade steel for tanks and planes. Turkey was one of the world's leading producers. The real tension lay in the Chrome War, where both the Axis and the Allies attempted to buy up the entire Turkish supply to deny it to the other. By using its raw materials as diplomatic leverage, Turkey was able to receive modern tanks from Germany and Spitfire planes from Britain while remaining technically at peace. This was a form of logistical shielding. The country was paying for its neutrality with its mountains, trading minerals for the time it needed to strengthen its own borders. In the background, the internal social revolution continued, though at a slower pace. At this stage, the village institutes were established to bring literacy and modern agricultural techniques to the deepest parts of Anatolia. The real tension lay in the gap between the modern, secular cities and the traditional, religious countryside. The deeper issue was that the republic needed to integrate the peasantry into the national economy to survive the war. Slowly, the institutes became a breeding ground for a new kind of rural intellectual, one who was loyal to the republic but understood the struggles of the farmer. This was the final logistical reach of the new Turkey into the heart of the Ottoman hinterland. On the surface, the city of Istanbul suffered deeply during the war. The quiet corridors of the palaces were dimmed by blackouts, and the Grand Harbor was empty of international liners. The real tension lay in the Varlık Vergisi, or the wealth tax of 1942, which heavily targeted the remaining non-Muslim minorities in the city, the Greeks, Jews, and Armenians, who had once been the commercial backbone of the empire. At a superficial level, it was a way to fund the army, but the deeper issue was the final, brutal phase of nationalizing the economy. Thousands who could not pay were sent to labor camps in eastern Anatolia. This remains one of the most controversial systemic acts of the Republic, a final severance of the cosmopolitan Ottoman commercial identity in favor of a singular Turkish one. What quietly determined the outcome of Turkey's war experience was its entry into the conflict at the very last moment, in February 1945. This was a purely symbolic move, a logistical requirement to become a founding member of the United Nations. In simple terms, Turkey had navigated the greatest slaughter in human history without losing a single city or a single generation of its youth. The real tension lay in the post-war realignment. As the months passed toward the Cold War, the threat from the Soviet Union in the north, demanding bases in the Straits and territory in the east, forced Turkey to choose a side. The quiet corridors of neutrality were finally abandoned as Turkey joined the Western Alliance and, eventually, NATO. Beneath all of this was the final decay of the Ottoman administrative ghost. The men who had been born under the Sultan and had transitioned the country into a republic were now aging out of power. The deeper issue was that the war had created a new set of demands for democracy and economic liberalization. The real tension lay in the move from a one-party state to a multi-party system in 1946 and 1950. As events unfolded, the quiet corridors of Ankara were open to a new kind of politician, the populist who appealed to the religious and rural voters who had felt left behind by the secular reforms. This was the final stage of the Ottoman-Turkish transition. The people who had been created by the Republic were now taking control of it. In simple terms, the story of the 1930s and 40s is the story of a nation surviving through logistical resilience. The real tension lay in the balance between internal revolution and external survival. The quiet corridors of the Dolmabahçe Palace remained as a symbol of where the nation had been, but the energy of the country was now found in the mines, the factories, and the village schools. The Ottoman past had been successfully archived, and the Turkish present was being tested by the pressures of a global war. The listener can feel the weight of this period, a quiet observation of how a state protects its sovereignty when the world is on fire. The post-war transition in the late 1940s and early 1950s marked a significant shift in the internal mechanics of the Turkish state, as the quiet corridors of power were forced to open to the voices of a multi-party democracy. On the surface, the Republican People's Party had ruled Turkey as a monolithic entity since its inception, but the real tension lay in the growing disconnect between the urban, secular elite and the rural, traditionalist majority. In simple terms, the intense social and economic pressures of the war years had created a deep-seated desire for change. What truly shaped the outcome of this period was the 1950 general election, which saw the landslide victory of the Democrat Party. This was not just a change in administration, it was a systemic shock that allowed for the first subtle rehabilitation of the Ottoman past in the public consciousness. Gradually, the habit of the mind that had strictly suppressed Ottoman nostalgia began to loosen. At a superficial level, the Democrat Party, led by Adnan Menderes, was still committed to the Republic, but the deeper issue was that their voter base was largely composed of the very people who had felt alienated by the aggressive secularism of the 1930s. The real tension lay in the reintroduction of religious elements into the public sphere. As events unfolded, the government allowed the call to prayer to be recited in its original Arabic once again, a practice that had been banned for 18 years in favor of a Turkish translation. This was a logistical reversal of one of the Republic's most symbolic cultural walls. The quiet corridors of the mosques began to hum with a traditional sound that many had thought was gone forever. Beneath all of this was a fundamental shift in the nation's economic logistics. At the core of the conflict was the move away from the statism of the previous decades toward a more liberal, market-oriented economy. In the background, the Marshall Plan brought a massive influx of American capital and agricultural machinery into Turkey. What quietly determined the outcome was the introduction of the tractor to the Anatolian plains. In simple terms, the modernization of agriculture allowed for a surplus of labor and food, which fueled a rapid wave of urbanization. As the months passed, the populations of Istanbul and Ankara swelled with migrants from the villages. These new urban dwellers brought with them their traditional Ottoman sensibilities, creating a new hybrid culture that challenged the sterile, westernized ideals of the Republican elite. The real tension lay in the physical transformation of Istanbul during the 1950s. Adnan Menderes launched a massive urban redevelopment program, carving wide boulevards through the ancient heart of the city. On the surface, this was an attempt to modernize the infrastructure to accommodate the new influx of cars and people. However, the deeper issue was that these projects often involved the demolition of hundreds of historic Ottoman structures, small mosques, fountains, and wooden houses that had defined the city's character for centuries. It might appear that the government was hostile to the past, but at a superficial level, they were also restoring grand imperial monuments like the Süleymaniye Mosque. This paradox reflected a systemic confusion. The state wanted to celebrate the glory of the Ottoman peak while clearing away the clutter of its long decline. As events unfolded, the 500th anniversary of the conquest of Constantinople in 1953 became a pivotal moment for the rehabilitation of imperial memory. From a distance, it seemed like a standard historical commemoration, but the real tension lay in the scale and the tone of the festivities. For the first time since the exile of the Sultan, the figure of Mehmed the Conqueror was celebrated not just as a military leader, but as a Turkish hero of global significance. In simple terms, the Republic was beginning to claim the Ottoman successes as part of its own national pedigree. The deeper issue was that the quiet corridors of history were being reopened to provide the nation with a sense of pride that was no longer strictly tied to the revolutionary struggle. This was a form of intellectual relaxation that allowed the people to be both Turkish and, in a cultural sense, heirs to an empire. In the background, the fate of the Dolmabahçe Palace continued to evolve. At this stage, the palace was no longer the exclusive retreat of the president, but was increasingly used as a prestigious venue for international summits and royal visits from foreign heads of state. The real tension lay in the contrast between the democratic rhetoric of the government and the imperial theater of the palace. Gradually, the furniture was uncovered, the chandeliers were lit, and the grand dinners returned. At a superficial level, it looked like the court had been restored, but the deeper issue was that the Sultan was now a prime minister in a business suit. The palace was being used as a logistical tool of diplomacy, a way to prove that the new Turkey possessed a heritage as grand as any in Europe. What truly shaped the outcome for the exiled Ottoman family was the partial lifting of the ban on their return. In 1952, the Democrat Party government passed a law allowing the female members of the dynasty to return to Turkey. The deeper issue was that the women were seen as less of a political threat than the men, who remained in exile until 1974. Slowly, elderly princesses began to arrive at the Istanbul docks, often unrecognizable to the public and possessing nothing but their memories. The real tension lay in their visits to the palaces. They walked through the quiet corridors of Dolmabahçe and Topkapı as tourists, often unnoticed by the crowds. In simple terms, the people who had once owned the rooms were now paying for tickets to see them. This was the final, quiet humiliation of the old order, a systemic proof that the monarchy was now purely a matter of history. As the months passed toward the late 1950s, the economic boom began to falter, leading to a period of intense social and political polarization. At the core of the conflict was the government's increasing use of religious rhetoric to maintain its grip on power. The secular establishment, the army, the universities, and the judiciary viewed this as a betrayal of the fundamental principles of the Republic. The real tension lay in the quiet corridors of the military barracks. The officers, who saw themselves as the ultimate guardians of Atatürk's legacy, were growing increasingly restless. Beneath all of this was the fear that the Ottoman ghost was being summoned back to dismantle the secular state. This existential anxiety eventually led to the military coup of May 27, 1960. In simple terms, the 1960 coup was a violent systemic correction. The Democrat Party was ousted, Adnan Menderes was executed, and a new constitution was drafted to ensure that no future government could deviate too far from the secular path. The real tension lay in the repression that followed. The subtle rehabilitation of the Ottoman past was abruptly halted, and the state returned to a more rigid, Kemalist interpretation of history. Gradually, the quiet corridors of the palace were dimmed once again, as the military leadership sought to cleanse the public sphere of what they deemed reactionary influences. The deeper issue was that the Republic had proven it was willing to use force against its own democratic institutions to preserve its revolutionary identity. At this stage, the city of Istanbul entered a period of melancholy reflection. The rapid modernization of the 1950s had left the city a patchwork of grand boulevards and half-finished projects. From a distance, it seemed that the imperial character of the city was being slowly erased by the gray concrete of the mid-century. The real tension lay in the concept of huzun, a specific Turkish word for a collective sense of sorrow and longing for a vanished glory. This feeling was particularly strong in the neighborhoods surrounding the old palaces. In the background, writers and artists began to explore the quiet corridors of the city's memory, seeking to understand what had been lost in the rush toward the future. The Ottoman past was no longer a political threat. It was becoming a source of poetic inspiration and nostalgia. What quietly determined the outcome of this period was the realization that the Republic and the Empire could not be entirely separated. In simple terms, you could not have a Turkish identity without the Ottoman foundation. As events unfolded in the 1960s, the state's approach to history became more institutionalized. The Ottoman archives were modernized, and scholarly research began to move past the simple hero vs. villain narratives of the early revolutionary years. The real tension lay in the academic sphere, where a new generation of historians began to look at the logistical and systemic reasons for the empire's decline. This was the birth of modern Ottoman studies, a process of turning a painful memory into a rigorous discipline. Slowly, the Dolmabahçe Palace settled into its role as a permanent museum under the administration of the National Palaces Department. At a superficial level, it was a tourist attraction, but the deeper issue was its role as a school for national memory. The quiet corridors were meticulously restored to their 19th century appearance. Every piece of furniture, every clock, and every painting was catalogued with a logistical precision that the sultans would have envied. Beneath all of this was the final victory of the archive. The life of the court was gone, but the physical evidence of that life was being preserved with a quasi-religious devotion. The palace had become a reliquary for a dead system, a place where the logic of the museum ensured that the shadow of God remained safely frozen in time. In simple terms, the story of the 1950s and 60s is the story of a nation trying to find a balance between its revolutionary future and its imperial past. The real tension lay in the fact that the two were constantly pulling in different directions. The quiet corridors of the palace remained as a silent witness to this struggle, hosting the funerals of the old elite and the receptions of the new military and political leaders. The deeper issue was that the Ottoman era was no longer a living reality, but a usable past, a collection of symbols and stories that could be deployed for national pride or political gain. The listener is left with a sense of the complex layers of history, a quiet observation of how a society navigates its own contradictions. The decade of the 1970s brought about the final legal resolution of the Ottoman exile, a move that quietly signaled the end of the dynasty's status as a systemic threat to the Turkish Republic. On the surface, the state had spent half a century maintaining a strict wall between the new nation and the old family, but the real tension lay in the fact that the original revolutionaries were passing away, and a new generation was looking at history with a different set of eyes. In simple terms, the ghost of the Sultanate had lost its power to frighten the military and political establishment. What truly shaped the outcome was the legislation passed in 1974, which finally granted the male descendants of the House of Osman the right to return to their homeland. This was the final logistical clearance of a law that had been born in a moment of existential crisis, but had survived into an era of modern statehood. Gradually, the aging princes began to return to Istanbul, many for the first time since their childhood in the 1920s. At a superficial level, their arrival was a minor news item in a Turkey preoccupied with the Cold War and internal political polarization, but the deeper issue was the profound sense of dislocation these men experienced. The real tension lay in the physical changes to the city they once called their own. They arrived at the new Ataturk airport and drove through a sprawl of concrete apartment blocks and industrial zones that had replaced the wooden villas and open gardens of the imperial era. Slowly, they made their way to the quiet corridors of the Dolmabahçe and Topkapı palaces, not as heirs, but as elderly men seeking to reconnect with their own childhood memories. The deeper issue during this period was the total lack of institutional support for the returning family. In simple terms, the law allowed them to return, but it did not return their property or provide them with any social standing. The real tension lay in their invisibility. While the Republic had once feared them as potential rallying points for rebellion, it now viewed them as historical curiosities. Beneath all of this was a logistical struggle for survival. Many of the returning princes were living on modest pensions from foreign countries or the charity of distant relatives. They lived in small, rented flats in neighborhoods like Nişantaşı or Beşiktaş, often within walking distance of the palaces where their ancestors had held absolute power over 3 continents. This was the final, quiet leveling of the imperial hierarchy. As events unfolded throughout the late 1970s and 1980s, a new cultural movement began to emerge in Turkey, often referred to as Ottoman nostalgia. From a distance, it might appear that the public was losing interest in the secular ideals of the Republic, but at the core of the conflict was a search for a more complex and inclusive identity. Slowly, the strict, austere modernism of the early Republican era began to feel restrictive. The real tension lay in the urban aesthetic. Architects and designers began to rediscover the motifs of the Ottoman past, the tulip patterns, the arched windows, and the use of traditional materials. This was not a political movement to restore the Sultan, but a systemic effort to reclaim a cultural language that had been suppressed for 50 years. Beneath all of this was the impact of mass tourism on the preservation of Ottoman sites. What quietly determined the outcome for the quiet corridors of Dolmabahçe was the realization that the Ottoman heritage was Turkey's most valuable soft power asset on the global stage. In simple terms, international visitors did not come to Istanbul to see modern concrete buildings. They came to see the grandeur of the empire. Gradually, the state increased its investment in the restoration of the imperial palaces, the grand bazaars, and the historic mosques. The real tension lay in the commercialization of history. The palaces were being polished and lit to satisfy the gaze of the global traveler, a logistical process that turned the sacred spaces of the court into the profitable products of the tourism industry. In the background, the 1980 military coup and the subsequent leadership of Turgut Özal provided a new political framework for this rehabilitation. Özal, a pragmatist who sought to blend Western market economics with traditional Turkish Islamic values, pioneered what became known as the Turkish Islamic synthesis. At a superficial level, this was a way to unite the country after the political violence of the 1970s. However, the deeper issue was that it officially integrated the Ottoman past into the Republican present. The real tension lay in the school textbooks, where the sultans were once again portrayed as great statesmen and defenders of the nation. The quiet corridors were no longer seen as a place of failure and bankruptcy, but as a source of national inspiration and continuity. As the months passed toward the end of the 20th century, the city of Istanbul underwent a re-imperialization of its skyline. The real tension lay in the contrast between the new skyscrapers of the financial district and the meticulously restored domes and minarets of the old city. At the core of the conflict was the question of which Istanbul was the real one. Slowly, the city's identity became a layer cake of different eras, where the Roman, Byzantine, Ottoman, and Republican elements lived in an uneasy but vibrant proximity. The quiet corridors of Dolmabahçe became a focal point for this identity, serving as a bridge between the European aspirations of the present and the imperial achievements of the past. What truly shaped the outcome for the descendants of the Sultan was their eventual role as cultural ambassadors. By now, the family had established the Ottoman Dynasty Foundation, an organization dedicated to preserving their history and genealogy. At a superficial level, they were invited to state funerals and cultural openings, treated with a level of respect that would have been unthinkable in the 1930s. The real tension lay in the normalization of the dynasty. They were no longer the enemies of the Republic, but they were also not its masters. They had become a specialized kind of celebrity, bearers of a name that still held a certain magic in the public imagination. The deeper issue was that the Republic had become strong enough and confident enough to embrace its former rivals without fear. Slowly, the logistical management of the Ottoman archives reached a new level of sophistication. In simple terms, the millions of documents that had once been a burden were now being digitized and open to researchers from around the world. The real tension lay in the rereading of Ottoman history. Scholars began to move away from the nationalistic myths of both the empire and the republic, seeking to understand the complex systemic reasons for the state's longevity and its eventual decline. At a superficial level, the archives were a collection of old paper, but the deeper issue was that they provided the data for a new, global understanding of the Middle East. The quiet corridors of the archive were the most active and productive part of the Ottoman legacy, helping to explain the roots of modern conflicts and the origins of modern states. Beneath all of this was the final decay of the revolutionary trauma. As events unfolded, the people who had lived through the fall of the empire and the rise of the republic passed away, taking with them the visceral memories of the struggle. For the new generation, the Ottoman era was as distant as the Roman Empire. The real tension lay in the aestheticization of the past. Ottoman food, Ottoman music, and Ottoman fashion became trendy in the cafes of Beyoğlu and the boutiques of Nişantaşı. This was a form of intellectual relaxation, where the symbols of the court were stripped of their political power and turned into lifestyle choices. The quiet corridors had been converted into a mood board for a modern, globalized Turkish identity. In simple terms, the story of the late 20th century is the story of the Ottoman past moving from the shadow into the light. The real tension lay in the balance between historical accuracy and nostalgic myth-making. The quiet corridors of the Dolmabahçe Palace were now the setting for high-definition television documentaries and glossy historical novels, which brought the life of the court to a mass audience that had never known its reality. The deeper issue was that the public was consuming a sanitized version of the empire, one of grand ceremonies and romantic intrigues, rather than the grim logistical constraints and the systemic failures that had led to the final day in 1922. As events unfolded toward the millennium, the Dolmabahçe Palace stood as a permanent anchor in the shifting currents of Turkish politics. At a superficial level, it was a museum, but the deeper issue was its role as a national sanctuary. The palace was where the transition had been finalized, and it was where the reconciliation was now being enacted. The quiet corridors were a place where the logic of the republic and the logic of the empire met in a silent, respectful stalemate. The listener can feel the weight of this piece, a quiet observation of how a nation eventually comes to terms with its own history. What quietly determined the outcome of this final phase was the maturity of the Turkish state. In simple terms, the republic no longer needed to hide its ancestors to prove its own legitimacy. It had built its own cities, fought its own wars, and created its own culture. The Ottoman past was now an asset to be managed rather than a threat to be feared. The real tension lay in the future. How would this rediscovered imperial identity influence Turkey's role in the 21st century? But that was a question for a different day. For now, the quiet corridors remained still. The dust settled on the crystal and the silk, and the Bosphorus continued its eternal flow past the palace gates. On the surface, the Dolmabahçe Palace is a masterpiece of 19th-century European architecture, but at the core of the conflict was a desperate physical attempt to rebrand the Ottoman Empire as a modern, progressive power. To walk through the palace today is to see the material evidence of the Tanzimat era, a period of intensive administrative and social restructuring that aimed to save the state by making it look and act like a European monarchy. In simple terms, the traditional Ottoman style of the Topkapı Palace, with its secluded pavilions and oriental courtyards, had become a logistical liability. It signaled a world that was being left behind. The deeper issue was that the Sultan Abdülmecid I, who commissioned the building in 1843, believed that by changing the architectural language of the court, he could change the political reality of the empire. The real tension lay in the choice of location and orientation. At a superficial level, the palace was built on a site reclaimed from the sea, Dolma, meaning filled, and Bas, meaning garden, on the shores of the Bosphorus. Unlike the landlocked, fortified palaces of the past, Dolmabahçe was open to the water, its long, white facade visible to every ship passing through the strait. This was a strategic piece of visual logistics. It was a palace designed to be seen by the Western powers. Beneath all of this was the move away from the walled city toward the European quarter. By moving the court from the historic peninsula to the shores of Beşiktaş, the Sultan was physically distancing himself from the traditionalist influences of the old city and aligning himself with the diplomatic and commercial energy of the modern world. What truly shaped the outcome of the palace's design was the collaboration between the Sultan and the Balian family, a dynasty of Armenian architects who had mastered the art of Ottoman baroque. In simple terms, they created a hybrid style that used the symmetrical, linear floor plans of European palaces while incorporating the traditional functional requirements of the Ottoman court. Gradually, the palace was divided into three distinct sections: the Mabani Humayun, the men's or administrative section, the Muayed Salonu, the ceremonial hall, and the Harimi Humayun, the family quarters. The real tension lay in this marriage of styles. The exterior looked like the Louvre or Buckingham Palace, but the interior still had to accommodate a lifestyle defined by strict gender segregation and imperial seclusion. At a superficial level, the most famous feature of the administrative section is the crystal staircase. From a distance, it appears as a floating, translucent structure with its balustrades made of solid baccarat crystal. The deeper issue was the origin of these materials. At the core of the conflict was the Ottoman desire for the best that Europe could offer. The brass work came from France, the marble from Italy, and the mahogany from the Americas. This was a form of global logistics displayed in a single staircase. Slowly, the staircase became a symbol of the empire's new identity, fragile, transparent, and beautiful, yet entirely dependent on external influences. The quiet corridors leading away from this staircase were filled with the offices of the new bureaucracy, where the clerks were learning to type and file in a manner that mirrored the modern cabinets of London and Paris. The real tension lay in the sheer scale of the Muayyad Salonu, the great ceremonial hall. This room was designed to house the most important rituals of the state, including the biannual greeting ceremonies, where the Sultan would receive the congratulations of the religious and military elite. In simple terms, the hall was a logistical marvel of its time. Its dome, rising 36 meters above the floor, was supported by 46 massive columns. But what quietly determined the outcome of the hall's fame was the massive Bohemian crystal chandelier, a gift from Queen Victoria. Weighing 4.5 tons and holding 750 lamps, it remains the largest of its kind in the world. Beneath all of this was the theater of power. The chandelier was not just a light source, but a physical weight of international prestige hanging over the head of the monarch. In the background, the flooring of the palace told its own story of national pride and industrial effort. Every room in the palace was covered with carpets from the Hirk imperial factory. These were not the tribal rugs of the Anatolian heartland. They were massive, intricate silk and wool tapestries designed to match the neoclassical ceilings. What truly shaped the outcome of the palace's interior atmosphere was this industrial traditionalism. The sultans were attempting to prove that Turkey could produce luxury goods that rivaled the best of Europe. The real tension lay in the fact that these carpets, some of which took years to weave, were being laid in rooms where the state's bankruptcy was being discussed. The quiet corridors were lined with silk, but the foundation they rested on was increasingly made of debt. At this stage, the harem section of the palace offers a unique look at the modernization of seclusion. From a distance, it might seem that the harem would remain a bastion of ancient tradition. However, at a superficial level, the rooms of the Sultan's wives and daughters were decorated in the latest Parisian fashions. They had pianos, French novels, and Western-style furniture. The real tension lay in the persistence of the old social structure within the new physical environment. Even in a room filled with Rococo mirrors and gilded chairs, the women were still forbidden from leaving the palace without permission or appearing in public unveiled. This was the systemic mismatch of the late Ottoman era. The hardware was modern, but the software was still deeply rooted in the traditions of the past. Beneath all of this was the logistical challenge of heating and lighting such a massive structure. In simple terms, Dolmabahçe was a 19th century building designed for a world that was about to be electrified. Gradually, the palace had to be retrofitted with gas lighting and later electricity. The real tension lay in the transition from the soft glow of candles to the harsh clarity of the light bulb. This change mirrored the secularization of the court. As events unfolded, the quiet corridors lost their shadowy, mysterious quality. Everything was now visible and exposed. This was a physical manifestation of the Tanzimat ideal, a government that was transparent, rational, and illuminated. But the deeper issue was that the more light that was shed on the empire's finances, the more precarious the palace's survival appeared to be. As months passed toward the end of the century, the Dolmabahçe clock tower was built near the entrance of the palace. At a superficial level, it was an ornamental addition, but at the core of the conflict was the Sultan's desire to regulate time itself. In the Ottoman past, time was ezani, meaning it was measured from sunset to sunset and varied every day. The clock tower, however, displayed vasati time, the standardized international time used for railways and telegraphs. This was a form of temporal logistics. By building the tower at the palace gate, the Sultan was signaling that the imperial court was now synchronized with the global world. The real tension lay in the sound of the bells. They were a constant reminder to the city that the old, organic rhythm of the Islamic day was being replaced by the mechanical rhythm of the modern state. What quietly determined the outcome of the palace's construction was its immense cost, 5 million Ottoman gold liras, equivalent to roughly $1.5 billion in today's currency. In simple terms, the palace was funded through foreign loans from British and French banks. The deeper issue was that the construction was happening just as the empire was losing its wealthiest territories in the Balkans. The real tension lay in the economics of grandeur. The Sultan believed that by building a palace that looked like a European power, he would be treated as an equal by the European powers, thus securing more favorable loan terms. It was a high-stakes logistical gamble that failed. By 1875, the empire was forced to declare sovereign default, and the quiet corridors of Dolmabahçe became the site where the sick man of Europe was administered by his international creditors. Slowly, the palace became a place of fortified anxiety. The grand gates, such as the Treasury Gate and the Imperial Gate, were masterpieces of wrought iron and carved stone, but at a superficial level, they were also barriers to a world that was becoming increasingly revolutionary. The real tension lay in the contrast between the delicate, lace-like stone carvings of the exterior and the growing militarization of the palace grounds. In the background, the Sultan's elite guards were constantly on alert for signs of domestic unrest or foreign intervention. The deeper issue was that no amount of architectural beauty could protect the monarchy from the systemic pressures of nationalism and social change. The palace was a fortress of glass, beautiful to look at, but incredibly easy to shatter. In simple terms, the story of Dolmabahçe's architecture is the story of the Ottoman struggle with modernity as performance. The sultans were not just building a home, they were building an argument for their own continued existence. They used the language of marble, crystal, and silk to say that they belonged in the family of nations. At the core of the conflict was the realization that while you can build a palace in a few years, you cannot rebuild a 600-year-old system as quickly. The quiet corridors remained as a silent testament to this effort, a place where the grandeur of the past and the pressures of the future met in a permanent, stone-cold stalemate. What truly shaped the outcome for the palace's survival into the 20th century was its ability to adapt to its new republican masters. As events unfolded, the very Europeanness of the building that had made it so controversial in the 19th century made it acceptable to the secular nationalists of the 1920s. They did not see it as a mosque palace that needed to be destroyed, but as a modern palace that could be repurposed. The logic of the building was secular and administrative from the start, which made the transition from the Sultan to the president much easier than it would have been at the older, more religious Topkapi. The palace had successfully pre-modernized itself, ensuring its own preservation even as the dynasty that built it was swept away. Gradually, we reach the end of this look at the physical soul of the palace. We have observed the logic behind the baccarat crystal, the Hirk carpets, and the bohemian chandeliers. We have seen how the palace was used to frame the Sultan as a modern monarch, and how it ultimately became the vault for his legacy. The narrative has followed the logistical path of the materials and the ideological path of the architects. The listener can feel the stillness of the grand halls, where the heavy weight of the past is held up by the slender columns of the future. The empire is gone, but the palace remains, a beautiful, silent explanation of why the Ottoman world chose to change the way it did. The final chapter of the Ottoman story is not found in the archives or the museums, but in the complex, living synthesis of the 21st century Turkish identity. On the surface, the Republic of Turkey has spent over a century defining itself against its imperial predecessor, but the deeper issue is that the Ottoman legacy has proven to be an inescapable part of the nation's DNA. As the decades have passed, the quiet corridors of the Dolmabahçe Palace have transitioned from being a symbol of a rejected past to a focal point for a new, globalized Turkish pride. In simple terms, the modern Turk no longer sees the Sultan as a threat to their secularism, but as a historical ancestor who provides depth and context to their national character. This is the ultimate systemic reconciliation, a society that has become confident enough in its modern institutions to finally embrace the complexity of its origins. What truly shaped the outcome of this contemporary perspective was the neo-Ottoman cultural boom of the early 2000s. In the background, Turkey's rapid economic growth and increasing geopolitical influence led to a renewed interest in the era when Istanbul was the center of a world-spanning empire. At a superficial level, this was visible in the explosion of historical television dramas, fashion trends, and architectural styles that mimicked the imperial peak. However, at the core of the conflict was a deeper psychological need to find a balance between the strict secularism of the early republic and the traditional religious values of the Anatolian heartland. Gradually, the Ottoman era became the middle ground, a space where history and faith could coexist without challenging the modern legal framework of the state. The real tension lay in the international perception of this Ottoman revival. From a distance, it appeared to many Western observers as a move away from European integration and toward a more assertive, Eastern-focused foreign policy. But in simple terms, the Turkish state was merely conducting a logistical audit of its own heritage. The government realized that its Ottoman history gave it a unique, soft power in the Balkans, the Middle East, and North Africa, territories that were once part of the same administrative system. Slowly, the quiet corridors of the palaces became the backdrop for diplomatic efforts to reconnect with these former provinces. This was the final logical conclusion of the transition. The empire was not being restored as a political entity, but as a cultural and economic network. Beneath all of this was the final professionalization of the Ottoman legacy. As events unfolded in the digital age, the millions of documents in the Ottoman archives were fully digitized, allowing researchers from every corner of the globe to access the operating system of the empire. The real tension lay in the democratization of knowledge. For the first time, History was not just what was written in the national textbooks. It was a vast, open-source data set that could be analyzed from a multitude of perspectives. What quietly determined the outcome of this scholarly shift was the realization that the Ottoman state was a remarkably sophisticated logistical machine, managing diversity and complexity with a level of efficiency that modern governments often struggle to match. The quiet corridors of the archive became a laboratory for understanding how large-scale human systems survive and fail. In simple terms, the physical preservation of the palaces reached a state of technological perfection in the 21st century. At a superficial level, the Dolmabahçe Palace is more pristine now than it was in the final days of Mehmed VI. In the background, teams of specialized restorers used laser cleaning, chemical analysis, and historical forensics to maintain every silk thread and crystal facet. The deeper issue was the transformation of the palace into a national brand. It is no longer just a building. It is a symbol of Turkish excellence and continuity. The real tension lay in the balance between tourism and conservation. With millions of visitors walking through the halls every year, the logistics of protecting the fragile interior have become a primary concern for the state. The palace is being loved to death, a final, ironic victory for a building that was once so lonely and neglected. Gradually, the story of the exiled Ottoman family also reached a point of closure. By now, the descendants of the sultans are private citizens who live diverse lives across the globe, from New York to London to Istanbul. The real tension lay in their final homecoming. Many members of the family have chosen to return to Turkey permanently, where they are treated with a quiet, respectful curiosity. At a superficial level, they are no longer royalty, but they are the keepers of a name that still commands a certain gravity. The deeper issue was the loss of the victim narrative. The family is no longer defined by their exile, but by their participation in the modern life of the Republic. They are the living bridge between the two worlds, proof that a dynasty can survive the loss of its throne without losing its soul. What truly shaped the outcome of Turkey's cultural identity in the 2020s was the integration of Ottoman and Republican symbols. In simple terms, you no longer have to choose between Ataturk and the sultans. At a superficial level, you can see the Turkish flag flying over an Ottoman palace and a modern airport named after the founder of the Republic sitting on land that once belonged to the imperial house. The real tension lay in the synthesis of these two legacies. The deeper issue was the creation of a total history, a narrative that accepts both the revolutionary necessity of the Republic and the historical grandeur of the empire. The quiet corridors of Dolmabahçe have become a place of intellectual relaxation for the nation, where the complexity of the past is no longer a source of pain, but a source of strength. Beneath all of this was the final logistical evolution of Istanbul. At the core of the conflict during the last decade was the massive scale of urban projects like the Marmara Tunnel under the Bosphorus and the new Istanbul airport. These projects often unearthed Byzantine and Ottoman ruins, forcing the state to confront the layers of time literally buried beneath the modern city. The real tension lay in the struggle between development and archaeology. What quietly determined the outcome was the decision to incorporate these findings into the modern infrastructure. The city has become a living archive, where you can take a high-speed train through a tunnel that passes beneath the sunken ships of the ancient world. The quiet corridors are now both horizontal and vertical, spanning the geography of the city and the depth of the soil. In simple terms, The lesson of the Ottoman court's final day is the lesson of systemic resilience. The real tension lay in the fear that the end of the monarchy would be the end of the Turkish people. But as events unfolded, it became clear that the state is more than its leader, and the nation is more than its form of government. The quiet corridors of the palace taught the world that even the most ancient and powerful systems must eventually make way for something new. The deeper issue was not that the Ottoman world failed, but that it successfully provided the raw materials, the people, the bureaucracy, the territory, for the world that replaced it. The transition was not a destruction, it was a metamorphosis. Slowly, we reach the final observation of this long journey through the corridors of time. We have seen the Sultan's quiet departure in the rain, the Caliph's hurried exile on a train, and the family's long, difficult journey through the 20th century. We have observed the Republic's struggle to find its own identity and its eventual reconciliation with its imperial past. At a superficial level, this is a story of a palace on a river, but the real tension lay in the heart of a people trying to understand their place in the world. The quiet corridors of Dolmabahçe remain still, but they are no longer empty. They are filled with the weight of a history that has been fully owned and understood. What quietly determined the outcome of this narrative was the realization that time does not move in a straight line, but in a circle. The questions that the sultans faced in the 19th century, how to modernize, how to balance the East and the West, how to manage diversity, are the same questions that the Republic faces today. In the background, the quiet corridors provide a space for reflection on these eternal problems. The palace is a reminder that power is temporary, but the responsibility of governance is permanent. The logic of the monarchy has been archived, but the logic of the state remains as active as ever. The transition is complete, and the archive is open.